The Victorian era, spanning the reign of Queen Victoria from 1837 to 1901, was a time of unprecedented transformation. The Industrial Revolution reshaped society, driving a mass migration from the countryside to burgeoning urban centers, and creating a new middle class with disposable income and a voracious appetite for goods and services. This societal upheaval profoundly altered the relationship between people and their food, forging a culinary landscape defined by a peculiar combination of opulence, privation, dangerous deception, and a new, almost obsessive focus on health. The weirdness of Victorian food is not a collection of random curiosities, but a direct consequence of this complex, contradictory age. It is a story of stark paradoxes. Technological innovation coexisting with lethal practices, immense wealth alongside dire poverty, and a fervent pursuit of purity in a world rife with unseen poisons. This report will explore these paradoxes through a thematic analysis of Victorian food culture, moving from the systemic problems of the food supply to the intimate rituals of the dining table. The following sections will detail the widespread practice of food adulteration, the profound chasm in diet between social classes, the elaborate and often absurd theater of dining etiquette, the health-driven choices behind the era's drinking habits, and the legacy of quackery and consumerism that defines the modern relationship with food. The most insidious and pervasive aspect of Victorian food culture was the widespread practice of food adulteration. This was not a minor issue or an isolated crime. It was a deeply ingrained, systemic problem that permeated every level of the food chain and made the simple act of eating a potential health hazard. The root of this deception lay in the new economic realities of the age, particularly the rapid growth of urban populations. With 4/5 of the population living in the countryside at the start of the 19th century, food was primarily produced and consumed locally. However, as more people moved to cities, a new imperative arose to find ways to transport and store food over long distances. While technological advancements like the railway network and canning made this possible, they also created a fertile environment for large-scale fraud, where food could pass through up to 3 intermediaries between farm and butcher. The economic incentives for food adulteration were powerful and pervasive. Traders and manufacturers were under intense pressure to cut costs and maximize profit margins in a highly competitive market. This created a situation where they were practically incentivized to secretly add cheaper and often inedible ingredients to their products. If a merchant chose not to adulterate their wares, they would likely be undercut and driven out of business by their less scrupulous competitors who sold bulked-up products at lower prices. This lack of regulation and the anonymity of long supply chains provided a large-scale opportunity for contamination and allowed adulteration to become a persistent problem that was basically unavoidable for the average consumer. No food item better illustrates the paradox of Victorian consumerism than bread. In an era when a dense, calorific brown bread was the healthy staple of the rural poor, the middle and upper classes developed a deep cultural preference for a pure white loaf. White bread was a symbol of quality and purity, representing a cleaner, more refined product. However, this seemingly pure loaf was, in a bitter irony, almost always adulterated with cheap additives. To achieve the desired color and bulk, bakers would add a compound called alum, a substance found in some detergents today. Alum had the dual property of whitening the bread while also allowing it to retain more water, making the loaf more compact and dense. Beyond alum, bakers and mill owners added an array of startling fillers to their flour, especially during periods when grain prices rose. These additives included chalk powder, fine sawdust, plaster of Paris, and even ground-up bones. Some sources suggest that up to 1/3 of a Victorian loaf of bread was not flour at all, but these types of additives. While a small amount of calcium carbonate, chalk, is still a permitted food additive today, its use in the Victorian era was for fraudulent bulk and profit rather than nutrition. The ingestion of these inedible fillers had severe and often deadly health consequences, causing serious digestive problems like constipation and chronic diarrhea, which could be fatal for a child. The practice of food adulteration was so widespread that by the mid-19th century, purity was the exception, not the rule. The desire to deceive consumers for profit extended beyond bulk to aesthetics, leading to a new wave of food adulteration for cosmetic purposes. To make products more beautiful to the eye, toxic dyes and minerals were added, creating a dangerous palette of poisoned foods. A prime example was mustard, which was made into a very, very bright yellow by adding highly toxic lead chromate, the same chemical compound used to paint American school buses. This dangerous practice, used to enhance the appearance of products, was not limited to mustard. Lead chromate was also used in confectionery and even snuff. The confectionery industry was a major culprit. Dr. Arthur Hill Hassel's famous report on food adulteration revealed that sweets with names like Kiss Me Now contained alarmingly high levels of lead-based colorings, making them quite poisonous. Other toxic coloring agents included mercury sulfide for red, copper sulfate and arsenic for blue, and copper arsenite for green. These were used to make candies attractive to children, a practice that highlights the complete lack of consumer protection at the time. Sugar itself was bulked out with plaster of Paris and limestone. A shocking example of this was the 1858 Bradford sweets poisoning, where over 200 people became seriously ill and around 20 died after eating sweets accidentally made with arsenic trioxide. The tragedy occurred after a druggist's assistant mistakenly sold 12 pounds of arsenic trioxide instead of a harmless white powder called DAF that was commonly used to bulk up sweets. The sweets were so potent that one source claims a single humbug contained enough arsenic to kill 2 people. The deaths were initially misdiagnosed as cholera, as the symptoms of both vomiting, abdominal pain, and diarrhea were similar. The incident, among others, led to new legislation like the Adulteration of Food or Drink Act 1860. Although the law was widely criticized for being too ambiguous and the penalties too low to act as a deterrent, adulteration was not limited to solid foods. Wine was a frequent target, especially after a mysterious vine-destroying disease called phylloxera spread across Europe from 1863, creating a wine shortage. This led to the creation of artificial wines and the widespread use of aniline dyes like fuchsine or magenta to improve color. These dyes were made using arsenic, and their use in wine caused poisoning incidents, including one that affected an entire village near Bordeaux in 1889. Gin, brandy, and rum were often watered down to increase profits, And to restore their kick, Cocculus indicus, a source of picrotoxin, was added. This caused giddiness, but also led to more severe symptoms like nausea, vomiting, gripping pain, and even death. The practice of adding adulterants like Cocculus indicus to spirits was made illegal in the mid-1800s. Even non-alcoholic beverages were compromised. Tea, a staple for both rich and poor, was adulterated with anything, including iron filings, various powders, and even already used tea leaves that were mixed with lead to make them look black. Green tea was sometimes colored with Prussian blue. The adulteration of tea with used leaves and various dyes and pigments was so common that it led to anti-Chinese sentiment, even though manufacturers in England were doing the same thing. Coffee was similarly debased. Dealers would use roasted peas, beans, and other grains to imitate coffee. They would also add sand, gravel, and sweepings of coffee to make the powder appear genuine. Perhaps one of the most poignant examples of dangerous adulteration was the milk supply, particularly for urban children. Faced with the reality of spoiling milk in a world without widespread refrigeration, merchants and even housewives resorted to adding chemicals to mask spoilage and extend shelf life. The chemical of choice was boric acid, or borax, which was sold in powder form and considered a beneficial purifier. The rationale was that as milk went bad, its pH would become acidic, and the addition of borax would bring it back to a neutral, palatable state. However, this practice was a deadly deception. The borax did not kill the harmful bacteria in the milk. It only neutralized the taste, creating a false sense of safety. A 5-gram dose of borax, the amount needed to neutralize half a liter of spoiled milk, was potentially lethal to a child. Symptoms of borax poisoning included heartburn, vomiting, and diarrhea for small doses, and brain and kidney damage for somewhat larger ones. And finally, death. This allowed deadly pathogens like brucella and bovine tuberculosis, TB, to persist, causing severe fevers that lasted for weeks, brain damage, and non-pulmonary TB that attacked internal organs and bones. In the case of bovine TB, it could cause abscesses to form in the spine, making vertebrae so fragile they would collapse, leading to deformity, paralysis, and death. It is believed that hundreds of thousands of children died from exposure to this bacterium. This shocking example reveals a profound paradox of the age, a society attempting to solve a logistical problem with chemical innovation, but in the absence of a full scientific understanding, inadvertently creating a public health catastrophe. The Scientific Crusade of Dr. Hassel. The turning point in the battle against food adulteration was the work of one man, Dr. Arthur Hill Hassel. His groundbreaking reports, published in The Lancet from 1851 to 1854, were a public sensation and a scientific triumph. Hassel's genius lay in his innovative use of the microscope, an instrument that had previously not been applied to food analysis. This new technology allowed him to see and document the invisible contaminants in everyday foods, providing unassailable evidence of fraud and impurity for the first time. As one contemporary observer noted in his obituary, the idea of using a microscope for this purpose had not occurred to anyone to put this simple idea into actual practice before Hassel. His work exposed the full scale of the problem, proving that adulteration was not a rare occurrence, but the rule and purity the exception. Hassel's findings, which were collected and published in his 1855 book, food and its adulterations were staggering. They included the discovery of mashed potatoes and alum in bread, turnips in marmalade, and sulfuric acid in gin. He also found copper sulfate in bottled fruits and preserves, lead chromate in mustard, and sulfate of iron in tea and beer, as well as various mineral colorants in sugar confectionery. The reports were so accurate that despite fearlessly naming the merchants from whom he had acquired the contaminated products, not a single libel suit was ever pursued against the Lancet. Hassel's scientific crusade provided the decisive impetus for reform, leading directly to the establishment of the first Parliamentary Select Committee on Food Purity in 1855, and ultimately to the passage of the 1860 Act to prevent the adulteration of food and drink. His work stands as a testament to how the application of a new scientific tool could transform a public health debate from one based on hearsay and rumor to one based on incontrovertible facts. The gastronomic divide from the gilded to the gutter. The food of the Victorian era was not a monolithic entity. It was a reflection of the era's rigid social stratification. What a person ate and when they ate it were powerful markers of their class and standing. The chasm between the gastronomic life of the wealthy elite and the urban poor was profound, yet a closer examination reveals a more complex and surprising reality. For the upper and middle classes, dining was an elaborate and theatrical affair, often prepared by chefs trained in French cuisine and influenced by books from celebrity chefs like Marie-Antoine Carême and Isabella Beeton. Dinner was the most important meal of the day, a multi-course event with lavish dishes designed to impress guests and showcase social status. The menus were meticulously planned, using a bill of fare to guide the evening's progression. The menus of these formal dinners often featured what would be considered bizarre or exotic dishes by modern standards. Guests might start with a soup course, such as mulligatawny soup or a clear gravy soup with marsala, and were advised against asking for a second helping to avoid delaying the main course. This could be followed by a fish course of stewed eels or fried soles. One dinner might list fried smelt with tartar sauce, a chicken vol au vent, a puff pastry filled with chicken in a cream sauce, and a roasted rib roast. The main course could also include a fricandeau of veal with spinach, croquettes of fowl, or a roasted capon stuffed with minced veal and truffles. A roasted capon, for example, would be slathered in butter and roasted over an open fire. One of the most prized meats was turtle, a luxury so sought after that chefs created mock turtle soup from boiled calf's head to meet the overwhelming demand. The calf's head would be boiled for an extended period, and the meat and brain were then added back to the broth to create a dish that was presented as, and was believed to be, turtle. The quest for culinary novelty also led to truly unusual concoctions, such as foie gras ice cream, where a duck-shaped mold of cayenne pepper ice cream was filled with foie gras. Other strange delicacies included roasted swan, bear's paws, and frog leg pie. A roasted swan would have its breast covered in a meal paste and then greased paper before being roasted. Bear's paws, considered a great delicacy, would be boiled in salted water until tender, then dipped in melted butter, egg, and breadcrumbs before being broiled and served with a spicy gravy. Snail soup was another dish on the elite's table, prepared by boiling specific snails, extracting the meat, and then stewing it to form a broth with herbs and spices. Peacock pie was a complex dish that required a young peacock to be rubbed with spices, baked in a butter crust, and served with its head placed on the cover. Dining could be an extreme experience, as one historical record describes a party where guests ate on horseback. The courses were served on horseback, with one menu listing raw oysters, soup, fish, a meat entree, and a final salad course with cheese, bread, and butter. In stark contrast to the elite, the urban poor often faced a daily struggle for survival. Their diet was dictated by a meager weekly budget, with the majority of funds spent on the cheapest and most filling staple, dense, calorific bread. For many, daily meals consisted of little more than bread and weak tea, a beverage made from tea leaves that were reused multiple times to extend their life. The diet of the very poor could be truly terrible, sometimes consisting of nothing but potatoes or rotten vegetables. A typical poor urban family would have about 12 shillings per week for food, and most of that went to bread. They could only afford meat once a week and would try to make it last as long as possible. However, the working-class diet also reveals the deep-seated culture of resourcefulness and a philosophy of waste not, want not, unconventional and often repulsive to modern tastes. Cuts of meat were a necessity. The poor consumed everything from soused pig's face, which was a boiled and brined pig's head, to slink, the meat of unborn lambs and calves. They were awfully keen on offal, relying on cheap and readily available organs like liver, kidneys, and sheep's trotters. The fat from roasted meats, known as dripping, was collected and used for frying or as a spread on bread. Broxy meat, from animals that had died from disease, was also eaten by the poor, though it carried transferable illnesses. For those with a few spare pennies, a vibrant street food economy offered an alternative to the meager home larder. Urban street vendors sold a range of hot, ready-to-eat meals, including jellied eels, cockles, mussels, whelks, hot-baked potatoes, meat and fruit pies, and fried fish. Eels were particularly abundant and inexpensive, and the dish of jellied eels was a popular and economical way to preserve the fish before refrigeration. Oysters were a particularly popular and affordable street food, with around 700 million consumed in London in 1864. Other popular street snacks included pickled winkles, sea snails, and whelks, which were sold ready to eat with vinegar and pepper. Baked goods like muffins and crumpets, which were brought to the streets wrapped in cloths to stay warm, were also a popular tea-time treat for all levels of society. While the popular image of the Victorian working class is one of widespread malnutrition and poverty, a deeper analysis of the period from 1850 to 1870 reveals a powerful counter-narrative. Medical research indicates that the diet of the urban mid-Victorian working class was in many ways superior to the modern diet, contributing to a life expectancy that matched today's at age 5. The explanation for this surprising vitality is a combination of high physical activity and a nutrient-dense diet based on locally available seasonal foods. The levels of physical labor in the mid-Victorian era were staggering. Men could consume over 5,000 calories a day, and women over 3,000, but they remained slim and fit due to their strenuous work. This high caloric expenditure meant they ate a vast quantity of food, and the food they consumed was, by necessity, a collection of what we now call superfoods. Their diet was rich in what we would now consider organic, pesticide-free fruits and vegetables, with some sources suggesting they ate 8 to 10 portions a day. Staple vegetables like onions, watercress, carrots, and cabbage were available and cheap year-round and were packed with vitamins and phytonutrients. Watercress, for example, was a regular breakfast item with bread and cheese and was high in iron and fiber. The working class also consumed a significant amount of fatty fish like herring and sprats, providing a rich source of omega-3 fatty acids. They consumed the whole fish, including the head and roe, which contributed to micronutrient levels that were approximately 10 times higher than in modern diets. Offal, the cheapest cuts of meat, was also consumed by all classes and was extremely high in vitamins and minerals, including iron and B vitamins. The culinary health of the working class began to decline in the late 19th century. Ironically, the same industrial factors that improved distribution also brought a new wave of cheap, processed, and imported foods into their diet, including tinned meat, canned fruit in syrup, and condensed milk. These foods, laden with fat, salt, and sugar, displaced the traditional nutrient-dense diet and led to a rise in obesity and a decline in physical stamina. A government report in 1904 found that working men were shorter than before and had lost their old stamina, a change attributed to the shift to processed foods. If the food supply was chaotic, the act of eating it in polite society was anything but. Victorian dining etiquette was not a series of arbitrary rules, but a complicated system of codified behaviors, designed to lubricate social exchange and enforce class hierarchy. A Victorian dinner party was a highly choreographed theatrical performance where every gesture, from a gentleman's escort of a lady to the placement of a napkin, carried meaning and signaled social standing. This system dictated an intricate set of rules for social interaction, particularly for men and women. A gentleman was expected to offer his left arm to the most honored lady, a practice that allowed his right arm to remain free unless he was a military officer in full dress and had his sword on the left. Gentlemen were expected to stand behind their chairs until all ladies were seated, and were also responsible for ensuring the glasses of the ladies beside them were filled. The hostess, for her part, was expected to remain calm and attentive, never displaying anxiety or giving audible directions to her servants. Guests were also expected to arrive 15 minutes late for dinner, seating for separation among. The most peculiar rules was the strict prohibition against seating spouses or people of the same profession next to each other. While this seems counterintuitive to modern notions of social comfort, it was a deliberate strategy to prevent an aside conversation that would injure the general conversation. The central purpose of a Victorian dinner party was not the food, but the communal, light, and easy conversation it was meant to foster. By separating people who shared too much in common, the hostess ensured that dialogue would remain broad and inclusive, keeping the performance of gaiety flowing smoothly for all present. Etiquette manuals advised hosts to be tactful and mindful of guests' political, religious, and general opinions when seating them. The food itself was a central prop in this theatrical setting, yet it was also a topic of conversation that was almost entirely off-limits. A hostess was never to pride herself on her dinner or apologize for bad food. Instead, she was to maintain silence on the matter and leave it to her guests to offer eulogiums. Similarly, a guest was not to examine minutely the food on their plate, as this was considered an insult that suggested a fear of finding something that should not be there. If a guest did find a problem, such as a worm in a nut, the proper procedure was to quietly and without remark hand the plate to a waiter and request a clean one. The focus on the food itself was considered a vulgar distraction from the true purpose of the event, the social exchange. The rules also extended to personal behavior, particularly in matters of hygiene and bodily function, which were subject to a rigid code of control. It was considered decidedly vulgar to make a noise while eating or to chew with one's mouth open. The act of picking one's teeth at the table was a mark of extreme rudeness, and even holding a hand or napkin over the mouth did not excuse the act. If one felt the need to blow their nose, they were advised to leave the table entirely, without asking permission, as the cause being manifest would excuse the departure. Guests were also instructed not to slurp food, eat noisily, or make noise with their cutlery. One should not fill their mouth so full that they cannot answer if addressed. When eating bread, it was considered vulgar to dip it into gravy and then bite it. Instead, small pieces should be broken off and conveyed to the mouth with a fork. The napkin, a crucial accessory, was to be placed on the lap and not tucked into clothing like a bib. It should be folded and placed on the table to the left of the plate when finished, as a signal to a waiter that the guest was finished and their plate could be cleared. Perhaps the most illuminating of these strictures was the one that forbade abstaining from taking the last piece on a dish. This seemingly nonsensical rule had a profound social meaning. The etiquette manuals of the time considered this most vulgar habit to be an insult toward your host. The gesture was a subtle suggestion that one was afraid of a scarcity of food and that the host would not be able to replenish the dish. By refusing the last piece, a guest was implicitly questioning the host's wealth and ability to provide. In a society where social status was so closely tied to material abundance, this act was a direct threat to the performance of affluence. The Victorian era was a time of immense social change, and nowhere was this more apparent than in the liquid consumption of its people. The era's drinking habits were not just a matter of taste, but a complex interplay of public health concerns, social class, and moral crusades. To a modern observer, the widespread consumption of low-alcohol beer by all social classes, including women and older children, might seem strange. However, this choice was rooted in a very practical and health-driven rationale. In the crowded, unsanitary cities of the era, clean, safe drinking water was hard to come by and often contaminated with sewage. As a result, waterborne diseases like cholera were rampant and deadly. The brewing process, which involved boiling the water, killed the germs that made plain water so dangerous, making weak beer a pragmatic and far safer alternative. This reality dictated the daily habits of millions, pushing them toward a substance that, while intoxicating, was perceived as a health-protective choice. The type of alcohol a person drank was a clear marker of their social standing. The upper classes and gentry had a preference for imported wines, particularly clarets and champagnes, along with fortified wines like port, sherry, and Madeira. Brandy was also popular, often mixed with soda. Queen Victoria herself was known to drink claret, which she would improve by adding whiskey. The popular sherry cobbler, a cocktail made with sherry, sugar, fruit, and crushed ice, became a very popular drink after the 1840s and was even tried by Queen Victoria herself. Gin and beer, on the other hand, were widely considered lower-class drinks and were often looked down upon. For example, Lord Cardigan of the 11th Hussars famously forbade his officers from drinking beer in the mess, viewing it as a beverage unsuitable for an elite regiment. Or the working class, low-alcohol beer and gin were the affordable staples. Gin, in particular, was very cheap, and its affordability contributed to significant social and health problems, particularly in densely populated urban centers. The prevalence of drunkenness was seen as a central feature of working-class life, fueling a growing moral and political debate. This public concern led to the rise of the temperance and later the teetotal movements. Led primarily by middle-class social reformers, these movements were a moral crusade aimed at curbing what they saw as the unruly drinking habits of the working class. The argument was both moral and economic. A man who spent his wages on alcohol was seen as wasteful and a failure who was hindering the industrial work regimen and threatening the stability of his family. The deeper significance of this movement lies in its class dynamics. It was an attempt by the middle class to instill its own values of thrift, self-denial, and personal responsibility into the working class. The movement's rhetoric, which linked drunkenness to laziness and poverty, effectively placed the blame for social problems on individual moral failings rather than on the systemic issues of poverty, poor working conditions, and urbanization. A more radical offshoot, the teetotal movement, was founded by 7 working-class men who pledged to abstain from all alcoholic beverages, including wine and beer. The temperance movement promoted institutions like the Band of Hope, founded in 1847 to save working-class children from the perils of drink, and the establishment of central halls to provide cheap, alcohol-free entertainment like concerts and films. While its most radical form, teetotalism, never achieved national prohibition, the movement successfully made the mass consumption of alcohol a central political and social issue, and it was a powerful force in a society obsessed with self-improvement and moral progress. Despite the moralizing, the Victorian era also saw a period of wild experimentation in mixology, particularly in America. While not widely consumed, the bizarre cocktail recipes of the era reveal a nascent and adventurous approach to alcoholic beverages. Examples include the Prairie Hen and White Cargo cocktails. The Prairie Hen was described as a sketchy breakfast dish rather than a cocktail, and it contained no alcohol, only 2 dashes of vinegar, 1 teaspoon of Worcestershire sauce, 1 whole egg, 2 dashes of Tabasco, and a little salt and pepper. The White Cargo was made with equal parts vanilla ice cream and gin, a concoction that, while strange to a modern palate, was a variation on the fairly common practice of mixing gin and milk in Great Britain. Other peculiar drinks included Angel's Wings, a layered concoction of raspberry syrup, maraschino liqueur, and crème de violette, and the Choker cocktail, an all-booze drink made with whiskey and absinthe. The Earthquake cocktail was another such drink, containing equal parts gin, whiskey, and absinthe, which the author of the Savoy Cocktail book described as being a drink with no real balance. The nosedive cocktail was a challenge where a small glass of gin with an olive was placed inside a larger glass, and the whole thing was topped with water or ginger ale, and the drinker was supposed to down the whole thing quickly while leaving the small glass behind. The sleeper cocktail, meanwhile, was made with rum, egg yolks, and hot water boiled with cloves, coriander seeds, and cinnamon. A drink from the American South, White Tiger's Milk, contained applejack, peach brandy, an egg white, and a full quart of pure milk. The Victorian era was consumed by the idea of health, a concept that was seen as the cornerstone of both physical and spiritual well-being. This societal preoccupation, born out of the public health crises of urbanization and the new scientific understanding of the body, created a fertile ground for both legitimate medical advancements and a flourishing market for bizarre food fads and dangerous quackery. With a new focus on the workings of the body, particularly the digestive system, a host of food faddists emerged to offer their own systems for achieving perfect health. One of the most famous was Horace Fletcher, the great masticator. His system, known as Fletcherism, required followers to chew each mouthful of food up to 100 times, or until it became a fluid and swallowed itself. Fletcher believed this method would maximize digestion and reduce the amount of food needed to live, promising to turn a pitiable glutton into an intelligent Epicurean. He also believed his system could cure everything from alcoholism to insanity. While his system had many followers, it was widely criticized by medical experts as quackery that could lead to serious health problems, including constipation, because it lacked the necessary indigestible bulk to stimulate the bowel. Beyond the eccentric, some fads were outright lethal in a period of a popular but concerning trend of Victorian anorexia, where frailty was associated with femininity and spiritual purity. A bizarre and dangerous practice emerged: the consumption of arsenic. Arsenic was widely available in Victorian Britain and was used in small doses as a stimulant and for cosmetic purposes. Women would eat arsenic wafers to achieve a sought-after pale complexion, a look that signified they did not work in the fields. The practice was known to be dangerous, but the belief was that low doses were safe. However, arsenic is a cumulative poison, and its use often led to a vicious cycle where the symptoms of poisoning, a grayish complexion, were mistaken for a need for more arsenic. The use of arsenic in food and medicine was so widespread that one historian called the 19th century the arsenic century. Even more notorious was the tapeworm diet, which involved swallowing capsules containing tapeworm eggs. The supposed logic was that the tapeworm would hatch inside the body and consume a portion of the ingested food, allowing the person to eat without gaining weight. The dangers of this diet were horrific, including abdominal pain, vomiting, malnutrition, organ damage, and intestinal obstruction. One source notes that a tapeworm can grow up to 82 feet long inside the human body. The diet was so dangerous that some sources suggest the pills were often a scam, but this has not stopped some illegal sellers from continuing the practice today. Other dangerous or bizarre fads included the vinegar diet, popularized by Lord Byron, which involved drinking a mixture of vinegar, honey, and water to cleanse the body. The practice was so dangerous that some historical accounts from 18th century France show that women who tried to lose weight by drinking vinegar died from it due to the symptoms of night sweats nausea, and ultimately tuberculosis. Another bizarre fad was slimming soap, which claimed to reduce fat without dieting or gymnastics, but was in fact just soap with basic ingredients like potassium chloride. The era's obsession with health also led to the rise of unregulated patent medicines that often contain dangerous and addictive substances like morphine, opium, cocaine, and heroin, which were marketed as cures for everything from a simple cough to syphilis and female weakness. The Victorian era was defined by a profound change in how food was stored and distributed, moving away from local, seasonal consumption toward a globalized market. Early forms of refrigeration relied on ice harvesting and ice boxes. Ice boxes were large cabinets with hollow walls lined with tin or zinc and were insulated with materials like cork, sawdust, straw, or seaweed. A large block of ice was placed in a tray at the top, and the cold air would sink, cooling the food below. The lowest shelf was the coldest, making it ideal for storing meat and dairy. This created a booming industry for icemen who delivered large blocks of ice to homes and businesses from horse-drawn carts. Ice was harvested from frozen lakes and ponds, then stored in insulated ice houses for year-round use. The work was arduous. Icemen often started their days at 4 a.m. and worked 7 days a week, including holidays, using tools like wires, hooks, and tongs to transport the heavy blocks of ice. The ice trade was revolutionized by innovations like the horse-drawn ice cutter, which allowed for uniform blocks to be cut from the ice, reducing the cost of harvesting winter ice from 30 cents per ton to 10 cents per ton. New insulation methods also decreased melting losses from 66% to under 8%, allowing ice to be shipped successfully around the world, even reaching Queen Victoria in the 1840s. Canning technology, first developed by Nicholas Appert in 1804, also came to prominence during this era. The tin can, patented in 1810 by Peter Durand, proved lighter and more durable than glass jars. Initially, canned food was expensive and used mainly by the military. However, by the 1860s, increased mechanization made smaller cans possible and reduced the cooking time for the contents. By the 1870s, canned meat was being imported to the UK from the US, Australia, and Argentina. Brands like Fray Bentos corned beef became popular with the working classes as a cheap and easy lunch. These long-life products, along with condensed milk, dried eggs, and soups, fundamentally changed the way people in cities ate, making meat and other previously expensive foods a regular part of all classes' diets for the first time. However, the early process was still crude, and unsanitary conditions in canneries meant that contaminated cans often slipped onto grocery shelves. The weirdness of Victorian food culture is a microcosm of a society in constant flux, where the forces of innovation, industrialization, and consumerism clashed with tradition and a lack of regulation. It was an era defined by a clash of opposites: the elegance of the dinner party against the filth of the food supply, the immense wealth of the elite against the utter poverty of the working class, and the scientific genius of a doctor with a microscope against the lethal folly of a tapeworm diet. This period was the crucible where modern food science, consumer protection, and nutritional awareness were forged out of chaos and often deadly mistakes. The Victorians pioneered large-scale food transport, developed canning technology, and laid the groundwork for modern refrigeration. But they also fell victim to food fraud and dangerous fads in their new, health-obsessed world. The shift from the surprisingly healthy mid-Victorian diet of local, nutrient-dense foods to one of cheap, processed imports offers a powerful historical lesson. This transition from a diet based on sustenance and seasonal availability to one based on convenience and mass production is a historical template for our own modern health crises, a powerful and enduring legacy from a truly bizarre and transformative time in food history.